Hey everyone, so I'm ready to share this project that I've been working on. What I want to do in this video is sort of give an introduction about what this is and what I hope to show with a lot of what I'm building here. So this is a series of projects that I've built that all do the same thing, but they all handle their data differently behind the scenes. So I have one project that handles the data like a parent-child relationship, which is something that you'll see actually in the Vue documentation, where they talk about you pass properties from a parent down to a child using props, and data flow from the child back up to the parent is handled via event emits. In this way, you sort of have this circular street here, but the parent is actually in charge of the data. They hold the data. If they change any of the data, that automatically gets populated down to a child. If a child wants to update the data, it has to emit an event to tell the parent to do it for it. That's a sort of style that works within sort of a limited set of components, and we'll see how that works. I'm going to skip down to the bottom here. The event bus is another way that people have looked at using Vue to handle a lot of the data management for it. And in this way, you sort of flatten out the hierarchy of the components that you have. You usually still have a main component, but it's just there to sort of organize the order of the other components. The other components actually talk to each other via emits on a universal event bus that they're all listening on. So the event bus here ends up being some sort of publish subscribe system where a component can tell the event bus, hey, this just happened to me. Let anyone else know who cares. And also a component can register on that event bus to say, hey, I want to listen to this certain type of event. If this happens, let me know. In this way, the components actually don't know about each other at all. They only know about these events that they're communicating with. So it sort of acts as building an interface that is sort of standardized across the application. And if you ever want to swap one component out for another, as long as they listen to and put out the same events, then that's perfectly fine. When you have a lot of events, that can get unwieldy on a very big application. So anything bigger than that is usually recommended that you use Vuex. So I also did the exact same application again, but Vuex is now handling the data behind the scenes. And so components can then connect to that Vuex store, can listen to certain state updates that might happen, and then we'll also have access to call actions on the Vuex to actually tell Vuex, hey, I need this certain kind of data, or hey, I need you to update this certain kind of data in your store. Please do that for me. And so we're going to look at all of these different types of projects. They all look exactly the same in the browser. They all function exactly the same, except for the logic behind the scenes and how the data is handled. So this should give a very clear idea of what are the differences between all three of these. And I want to really talk about the pros and the cons, and I'll have a video on each one of these, really diving in. Probably have videos with a sort of compare and contrast, where after describing what each of these are, I'll say, okay, let's look at parent-child versus event bus, and let's look at event bus versus Vuex, and sort of try and dig into what those differences are, why you would want to pick one over the other, and things like that. So that's a series of videos I'm hoping to come up with. Probably post them once I have a couple of these together. But first, what I want to do is I actually want to dive in and take a look at what's common between all of them. So how are these all the same project? So if I take a look at, I imported this into Code Sandbox, so we can take a look at this. And what we have is a standard, so I just used Vue CLI to just generate a project for me, and it sort of basically made a base project. And I added some components in here in order to build out a book search application. So you can do a search for something like Lord of the, and do a submit here. It'll go out to an open library API, search through all the books, and return the results here. And so you can see we have Lord of the Rings, we have Lord of the Flies. If I click on Lord of the Flies, it brings up some extra information here in a little modal, and that's the application. So how many components are there here? Well, taking a look back at the project, if we open up the components, there's 4 different components. So first you have the book search, and that is this little text area up here at the top. We then have the book tiles, So the tiles takes all of that search data, loops through it, and creates a tile for each book, which means there also is a book tile class that represents one certain book. And then that modal is handled as this detail. So there's a book detail that uses that modal to pop up. And how these things function and work depend a little bit on how the data is handled. So we will look into sort of how that stuff is being kicked off. Other parts of this application, I did create a service for the API. I didn't want this living in one certain place. This is going to be used differently in each application. So I created a service to handle that. And this does a search for the title. So given a certain title query, it will call the Open Library API and do the search. It also will get you a cover URL. So all of those covers are also pulled from this library, and this will return back to whatever component calls it, a URL for the cover with a certain size. So they have a small, medium, and a large. By default, it'll be medium, but you can always pass in something else to see what else you have. And all of these projects are available in that URL that I showed earlier. So up here at gitlab.com, kind of calling this clear view. I'm thinking of putting some other view things in here where I try and describe these processes. And we can take a look at that. And so you can come in here. All these projects are public. You can pull them down. Like I said, I'm using the Vue CLI to build them. So you should be able to just pull them down, run npm install with a newer version of npm, and be able to run these projects yourself locally and play around with them. So like I said, we're going to dive into some of these projects next, but the overall sort of architecture and where the files are is the same. The big difference is how data is handled, and we'll dive into that when I start looking at these individual projects.